Um, let's jump right in this morning. I'm gonna share my screen just so that we can do a little bit of review, as we always do, of where we're at and where we've come from. Um, so we've been exploring this concept of dat Yehudit, and let's just use just this one line from Rambam from the Mishnah Torah as a great summary of it, because I think that this is a good encapsulation. And he asks it, right? He says, "Ezo hi dat Yehudit." What is this thing called dat Yehudit? Um, and it's the minhag of tzniut according to which Jewish women conduct themselves. So this is basically where we get to um, broadly an understanding that dat Yehudit is a custom, meaning it's not a prescribed list of behaviors. It's customs. And who is it? According to which Jewish women conduct themselves, meaning the source of it may be guided from other texts or other traditions, but it's coming up, it's grassroots, right? It's coming up from the community of specific women themselves. And that's pretty broadly accepted in the tradition. And it's contrasted, just as a reminder, with Dat Moshe, the law of Moses, which is kind of the more hierarchical, vertical, um, top down. And as we'll come to see, it's not a coincidence that those are kind of gendered in the way that they are, that like Moses in the masculine version is the more kind of rigid, formal, and the Yehudit. Remember, the fact that the word Yehudit is feminine is just grammar, but it's a nice coincidence that it works out that way because we see that the practices associated with women are much more organic and innovative and creative in that way. So this is just a good summary of where we're at and where we're going. So then, of course, the question is, how does that evolve? Who gets to decide that? We've already answered that. Well, it's the women, but what we want to know is, like, what are the parameters? We often use like kashrut as a great kind of foil in trying to figure all this stuff out. And this is not a system where like a quorum of women in a Jewish community somewhere could get together and decide that shrimp is kosher. It wouldn't work that way. Um, it still has to be within the bounds of the system. And so that's where we're going today in these texts, is to start taking a look at what's the evolution, right? How does that happen? So we're on page 9. Um, and we're going to start off with a text from Proverbs that also sets us up with a useful framework where the I don't know what the word for somebody who says Proverbs is, right? Like the psalmist is the person who says Psalms. I don't know who says the Proverbs. Traditionally, it's understood to be Shlomo, King Solomon. Uh, but I don't know. Okay, so the poet, the author of Proverbs says, Shma b'ni musar avicha, ve'al titosh torati mecha. What's he saying? Listen, my son, to the musar of your father and the Torah of your mother. And I left those untranslated on purpose. Um, Today, when you hear the word musar, it often refers to a very specific discipline, a very specific kind of school of spiritual practice. So you can think of it as capital M Musar, and that has to do with kind of personal ethics and personal refinement. It's a Lithuanian, Belarusian practice, Ukrainian practice that developed in the modern period. That's not what this is. This is lowercase Musar, and Musar here is um, tradition, really. It comes from the shoresh, from the root to like to transmit. And so there's two things being contrasted here, right? It's very obvious they're being contrasted, right? The Musar of your father and the Torah of your mother. So what are these two different things? If the father has the tradition, what is the Torah of your mother? It's the Hebrew is Torah imecha. It's a really beautiful a beautiful concept. So obviously, I have to let my mom read this. So, Mom, will you read Rashi's commentary on this? Text number 16.
Listen, my son, to the Musar of your father, what the Holy Blessed One gave Moses in writing and orally.
Okay, so the Musar Avicha, the Musar of your father is what? It's the received wisdom, right? It's what God gives to Moses. And look what Rashi does, right? Very clearly, he's operating in kind of the traditional framework where it's not just the written Torah, it's also the oral Torah. So it's the Mishnah and the Talmud. So that's the Musar of your father. And what is Imecha? What is your mother? This is a really neat move he makes here.
Imecha, your mother, that is Amatecha, your nation, like the nation of Israel, as in Ezekiel. What a lioness was your mother, meaning your nation. These are the words of the scribes, which they innovated and added and made safeguards for the Torah.
What's Rashi doing here? Oh, yeah, I'm just gonna make a request just to make the text bigger. Totally can do that. Yes. What's Rashi doing? Yeah, Vanix.
It's all backwards. Generally, do we not refer to Torah in the masculine sense and anything else, Musar in particular, to the feminine sense, tradition to the feminine sense?
Say more about that. What do you mean by referring to Torah in the masculine?
Well, there are 613 commandments in Torah. And of those 613, the men are required to do all, and women only required to do some.
Great. Okay.
And therefore it's more of a, and therefore Torah, first of all, I think it's a masculine word, but I'm not.
It's feminine. It's feminine. Yeah.
Okay, so then withdraw that comment. But the fact remains that it's aimed at men.
Yeah.
Men are, with apologies to the four other women on this call, five other women on this call. Men are the important ones, and women are the unimportant ones.
Yeah, I think I see what you're saying. I would not say that. I wouldn't say important and unimportant. It's just from our perspective, that's an understandable kind of critique of the text. Women are certainly, even in Rashi's perspective, are vitally important. It's just in a different way than we might say. But I think what you're saying is, certainly by the time of Rashi, the understanding is that Torah, the content of Torah, oral and written, has much more orientation toward men, and certainly in terms of practice, right, and obligation. And am I right in then hearing that what you're saying is it's interesting then that becomes referred to the women here, right? But that's a really good observation. And you also kind of came about it the other way, but like the word Torah itself is feminine. And often many of the metaphors that we use for Torah are, if not explicitly feminine, like definitely like in the land, in that world, like water is a very common metaphor for Torah. Lots of like agricultural stuff, seeds and wombs and trees, and right, like even if those aren't explicitly feminine, they're definitely like in that world of like bio creativity, and can certainly be understood to be coming like if not feminine in and of themselves, like from a feminine perspective, and like that's the source of a lot of feminist interpretations of Torah. So it's a neat observation. Yeah. I guess it's also helpful to distinguish between capital T Torah and lower T Torah. Capital T Torah being the 5 books, or for Rashi, plus the Talmud and the Mishnah, and lower T Torah being teaching, right? Learning, kind of Jewish learning writ large. that's a that's like common parlance to this day. Like you'll hear people say like, "Oh, teach me some good Torah." They don't literally mean like read from a Sefer Torah or from a Chumash. They're meaning like teach me something good Jewish, right? Okay, so that's an interesting piece. What else with what Rashi's doing in his commentary? Oh, sorry, Mom, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I guess I'll respond to what you and Peter have been exchanging, and then there's something else completely different that I want to bring up. So I really love this Torah Timecha. I think it's really quite beautiful, and I'm thinking about how disclaimer, yes, this is about what we would call traditional male and female roles, but it shows that there's a recognition of the importance of the mother in the life of a human being. Because right from the start, you're going to be exposed to the Torah of your mother. And that is true of male and female children. And yes, there is a point at which those diverge, and children will stay with the mothers, girls will stay with their mothers until they marry, and boys will be more out in the world. But there is this, I think, lovely idea that the mother has this responsibility to transmit Torah as well. The other thing that jumps out at me after reading Rashi is the language of God and the people of Israel being like man and wife. So you think about, there's a lot of Isaiah, later Isaiah, especially, that's that Song of Songs, which we just read for Pesach, being sort of a love story between God and Israel. So I think that, the Musar of the father, if that is the written and oral Torah, so that's God. And then transforming the mother into the nation by little play with the word
Yeah.
is quite lovely too. So
Cool.
yeah, and I find this, that the metaphors about God and Israel quite moving. And it'll be a couple of months before we start really reading that in Haftorahs, but that's what jumped out at me.
Yeah. So very quickly, it's moving, and it's moving for a reason, right? Because it's very human, right? It's interesting to read this next to Maimonides, who would absolutely reject the kind of personification of God in that way. But there's a reason that that's what Kabbalah turns to, right? Is specifically like, what is the human example of the closest partnership that we can think of? And for the Kabbalist, and for many people, it's between a husband and wife, between two partners, right? Who are building a family with each other. And that becomes the perfect metaphor for people who are feeling bereft of God. And so it's no wonder that that pops up over and over and over again. It is expanded upon most fully in Kabbalah, in traditional Kabbalah, but it even predates Kabbalah, right? The Kabbalists didn't make that out of nowhere. They're seeing it here. And so, Mom, you're pointing out something great. I love that you're drawing my attention to something that I didn't catch, specifically in the piece of Imecha, and that's there's the metaphor itself, just for like, what is the metaphor of referring to Torah to Imecha? But then there's what happens when you combine that with Musar Avicha. So let's zoom in first into the first question. What's the metaphor that Rashi's giving, and how is he? What's the move that he makes? Because he makes this interesting creative move. And then let's go back. I mean, you kind of answered it already, but then let's add it back into what happens when you combine that with Musar Avicha. So let's just look very directly at the text. What's the specific move that Rashi makes, right? The proverb says Torah Timecha, and what does Rashi do? How does he understand Imecha?
Not as a specific mother, but as the entire people.
Yeah, not as a specific mother or even as like the archetypal mother, but he makes a move to a different word, right? Like a different concept as a whole. Now it happens that they're closely related, right? M for mother, right? M traditionally, or ima for mother, and or for people, right? So those work very nicely to be able to make that move. Hey, they're even the same letters, right? So that works very well. And he grounds it, right? So again, this is why sometimes the Midrashim here are so good, is like that move isn't just a coincidence. It happens in the text from Yechezkel, right? That when you read Ma'imcha Levi, right? What a lioness was your mother, is very clearly, when you go and read the text in Ezekiel right there, that mother there is a metaphor for the nation, right? And so Rashi can take that metaphor and bring it back here and say, like, look, we have this tradition where sometimes the word mother is used as a metaphor for the people as a whole. I'm going to use that right here. And he retrojects, or the opposite, injects it in to his commentary here to say, if Musar Avicha is Torah and Talmud, then what is the Torah of your mothers? It's not literally mothers, it's the Torah of your people. It's the Torah of all of Israel, right? And that's where he gets to Amatecha, right? The Torah of the people as a whole. And what does that mean, right? That's like great metaphor, but then he actually tells us literally what he's thinking of. So, it's very nice to say, like, well, I have this metaphor for the Torah of your mothers, and I have this very nice metaphor for the Torah of the people as a whole. Then he tells us, which is very helpful, and he says it's the words of the scribes. Why is that? Like the later scribes, right? All the people who come later and are writing on Torah, all of the rabbis. Why? Because what did they do? They innovated and added, made safeguards for the Torah. He's saying, what is the Torah of the people? It's the creative, grassroots, innovative enterprise of expounding upon the received tradition. Mom, you have your hand up, and then let's go back to the first question.
Yeah, just a thought I had about lioness. I mean, you think of a lioness as being fiercely protective of her young. And I think there's something in here, and I'm relating that to the last phrase about making safeguards for the Torah. There's something in there about the responsibility of
Cool.
being a lioness when you protect the Torah. And that could be seen as applying to everybody, or it can be seen as applying also specifically to women.
Yeah. Wow, that's a great idea. It would be interesting to go and look at let's look at the actual I'm just going to switch the share here. Give me 1 second. New share. Ezekiel 19:2. Oh, look what we find in Ezekiel 19. Now it happens to be, okay, it's a dirge. But Mom, will you just read verses 1 through 3 here?
And you are to intone a dirge over the princes of Israel and say, what a lioness was your mother among the lions. Crouching among the great beasts, she reared her cubs. She raised up one of her cubs. He became a great beast. He learned to hunt prey. He devoured people.
Great. So that notion is not a coincidence, right? It seems, Rashi is certainly familiar with this text. Did he, in drawing on this midrash, explicitly want to bring in that kind of feminine protective imagery? Not sure, right? We don't know. Did he specifically, I would say it's probably not a coincidence that the generative, creative, innovative metaphor for Torah is feminine. Probably not a coincidence, right? We don't know for sure, but the beauty of it is, like, we can take that and, like, look how rich and multi-layered the metaphor is, and it's not hammered together, right? It all kind of just like flows out right from within itself here. Just one more piece, and then we'll go to the Vanix. That that works kind of. There's two ways you can look at this. You can look at this as these are just the two different metaphors for understanding Torah. That you need both the written and oral received tradition, but you also need the creative, innovative kind of version from the people, right? That you and we need both of these. And the metaphor that we're cobbling together that comes from Proverbs, but it exists elsewhere, is from like father and mother. But the other way of looking at, and that, by the way, works if your frame of reference for the metaphor is of the child. Everybody get what I'm saying? When you read in Proverbs, listen, my son, to the Musar of your father and the Torah of the mother. Where are we, the reader? We're positioning ourselves as who? The son, right? And that we get that thing from both places, right? But mom, you kind of pointed something out a little bit different, that you could position yourself differently in this metaphor if you're not reading it as the reader of Proverbs. You could read it as you're the wife, you're the mother, right? Because that's who we are, right? And we're in, as by the time you get to the Midrash and the commentary on this, we're the other people. And now who are we? We're not the recipients of this. We're the creative partners with God. Right? That you need both. You need both the received wisdom that's coming from God, and also the creative partner, which is us. And that, hello, that's also deeply, we are deep in the realm of Kabbalah here, to say that like we are active partners with God in the creation of Torah, right? But what a beautiful idea. And how does that work? Because the metaphor works that way, right? It's like when biblical poetry and midrash kind of fit together in this way, it's just marvelous how much can come out of it. So two really great ways of looking at this. One is that these are two sources that we're the recipients of. And the other way of looking at it is we are actually one of the sources of these. And via the metaphor of father and mother, we are partnering with God in creating what? In creating life. Lovely. Thanks for pointing that out, Mom. Torah imecha, right? Torah of my mom. Great. Okay, Vanix.
I think by now most people who are on this call know that I'm a literalist and somewhat of a cynic. And I agree to them. I understand all of what's been said, but I find the idea, Rashi's idea of, no, Rashi's methodology of actually changing the word from imecha to amecha. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Matcha. I find that coming out of left field. And what I mean by that is who gives, and please don't take this literally, but who gives Rashi the right to change what was said in Proverbs?
But he's not, right? He's not changing it, right? So first of all, Rashi is drawing on Midrash. It's right, it's not always quoted, right? But he's drawing on earlier traditions to kind of put this all together. But that's the entire rabbinic enterprise, right? In a way, Proverbs is giving license to that, right? It's already distinguishing between two different sources, right? Between one source that's more formal and one source that's more informal, and that's in the Tanakh itself. But who gives him the right? That's the evolution of rabbinic thought, right? That's the entire enterprise of Judaism, and he's not saying that the Torah literally means something else. He's telling us how to interpret and understand those words, because just on its own in Proverbs, it's not clear what Musar is, and it's not clear what Torah is necessarily, right? Clearly it's poetry, right? Proverbs is poetry. And if it's poetry, that means even though you're a literalist, which is fine, because the pshat, the literal interpretation of the text, absolutely has a place in our tradition, right? But when it's poetry, in the same way that if you read a poem, right, and you said, you know, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? You're not literally saying that the other person is an abstract concept of a season. You're saying that there's something about the attribute of summer that can be mapped on to a human being. And Torah works the same way, right? There's beautiful poetry in the Torah. And that's what invites us into the system, right? So who gives Rashi that right? We do, right? The entire canon of Jewish wisdom and rabbinic thought gives us that right. And again, like here's what I'll go back to like my kashrut example. You can't say, hey, when the Torah says don't boil a kid in its mother's milk, it means you can boil a kid in its mother's milk. You still have to like work within the system. And that's why I would push back on your assessment and say it's not out of left field. It's actually it's very coherent, right? He's not saying Torat Imecha means the Torah of I don't know, the Canaanites, or of specifically the Torah of the rabbis, right? He's drawing on a text from the Tanakh where that metaphor already is in place. And that's why, yeah, listen, sometimes the rabbis say when it says X, it means Y. But here he's not doing that. He's saying, I actually have an existing tradition that's coherent, where the metaphor functions as a whole, and he's drawing on that. And then just to close this little chapter for us, it makes sense in the when you read all of that back just into Proverbs, it makes sense. It makes sense that you would have one tradition that's saying Torah and the activity of creating Torah and commenting on it is this innovative piece. And then how would you contrast that with the more conservative piece, right? That kind of balance fits, especially when you look at the text itself, which is clearly drawing between mother and father, right? Meaning there's two kinds of opposites. And to say that one is more liberalizing and one is more conservative fits within the function of the metaphor as a whole. Now, if what you're looking for is a purely literal read of Jewish life and practice, I don't think there's a Karaite shul in Toronto. I know there's one in Los Angeles. So if you want to hike across the country to LA, you can hang out with lots of people who are like, this whole rabbinic thing, not for me. I want like Torah as in written, right? But that's not who the rabbis are, and that's not who most Jews are today. It can be frustrating when sometimes the reach is really reaching, and like absolutely. But I would say right here, Rashi's commentary is like a very nice little package system. And in that system, we get what am I trying to say here? Basically an encapsulation of one of the completely foundational debates in Judaism that has kind of two orientations to it, right? Or two hashkafas, right? One is that our purpose is to carry out the received tradition, which we have received, right? To do our best to enact that. Musar avicha. And the other side is our job is to make sure that that stays alive and is vital and continually adapts for each generation to come. And that's Torat Imecha, right? That debate is across the entire Talmud. This question of do we preserve or do we innovate? It's never resolved. And was the area of my rabbinic research, and my argument is that's on purpose. It's on purpose that it's not resolved because you need both. Right? You constantly need to be doing this balance between preserving the tradition that came before you and innovating and adapting so that it reflects the period that you're in. Right? And it's on purpose that it's unresolved. Okay. So why is that text here? Because Torat Imecha, in addition to just being a lovely metaphor, comes to be an entire category, right? It comes to actually be a formal category within Judaism. So Torat Imecha is kind of all of the stuff that you've learned and come to practice that's not within Torah and Talmud itself, right? Minhag, definitely within Torat Imecha. Okay? And here we'd go back to the fact that it's associated with the mother, with the feminine, with women, is, I would say, as close as to being on purpose as you can get, right? Can't say for certain, but like, I would say, like, come on, right? It seems to be fairly clear that it's that way. So what we come to have is an understanding that there is an important chain of tradition that goes through the mothers. And it's called Torah, right? That's the other Peter, you helped point us out. It was like, isn't it interesting that that's the one you could have said Torah Tavicha, right? The Torah of your fathers, but Torah gets associated with mothers. And now it happens that it works very well because we have this text from Proverbs that already refers to it that way. But it's a helpful reminder of the critical role that women play in the transmitting of custom and tradition across the generations. Okay. What we're going to look at now, and why did we start with these two texts? Because there is this helps us build the foundation for understanding that once you have this category called Torah Timecha, this understanding that there's innovations and additions, well, of course it evolves, and it evolves in association with women in particular. So we're going to look right now at a teshuva, at an answer to a question from a rabbi known as the Rashba. He's got a great long name, but I'm going to write it in the chat because it's not necessarily it doesn't transliterate great. His name is Shlomo ben Avraham ibn Adret. Ibn is Arabic for Ben, for son of, right? And he has an Arabic in his name because he lives in Barcelona in the 13th century, in the very beginning of the 14th century. He's a halachic authority. He's a Talmudist. He comments on a lot of the Talmud. He was a student of Nachmanides, of the Ramban, and he was a leader of the community there. And he puts together a collection of all of his answers to other people's questions, right? That's why it's tshuvot. Tshuvot means answers. And let's look at what he says. Now, the question that somebody writes to him has to do with, told you that this section of our text would have to do with shaving and body hair. The question that somebody writes to him, presumably a man writes the question to him, and the question has to do with how much of my body hair can I shave? Is the question that gets sent to him, right? Very important question in 13th century Spain, apparently. But the answer that comes back, there's no as far as I know, there's no category in the Torah around that. But the answer that comes back is about dress instead. And the I guess the reason that would be a question that somebody would write has to do with gender norms and the question of if I shave my body, am I starting to behave too much like a woman? And am I entering into the realm of cross-dressing, which the Torah frowns upon? That the Torah does explicitly prohibit, that you can't wear clothes of the opposite gender. And so that's probably what's behind the question that gets sent to the Rashba. Who wants to read about dress and cross-dress and all of it? Peter, one of the Vanics, why don't you kick us off right here? Will you start reading Tshuvot Rashba? This is text 17.
There's a distinction among women's ornaments between times and places. There is also a distinction among different garments. For thus they practice here that clothes of linen and clothes of cotton, men don't wear them dyed, but clothes of silk and clothes of fine wool, men wear them dyed in all kinds of colors.
Okay, hang tight right there. So so the question is can I do this? Can I do this behavior which might transgress this prohibition against cross-dressing? And how we'll get to his direct answer, but what's he leading up to? Why is he telling us these pieces? What kind of argument? If you imagine this is playing out in a court, what's the evidence he's trying to bring out, Mom?
Yeah, that clearly there's a diversity of practice, not only from place to place, but through time.
Yeah.
Things change.
Right. And a diversity of what practice?
Of men's clothing in these sentences, right? Of fabric, or the type of fiber, and dyed or not dyed.
So both a difference in men's fabric, but also, this is me leading us along. He starts off with saying women's clothing, right?
Oh, right. Sorry, I missed that in the first. Yeah.
Right. Both. Meaning, okay, so now let's go back to the Torah's prohibition. When the Torah says that you can't dress up like a woman, what's the Rashba's answer to that? Just that one line.
Well, it's hard to define exactly what that means.
What does it even mean, right? Like it assumes that there's a single standard of what a woman dresses like. And the Rashba points out, like, on a second, I know, as this person living in cosmopolitan Barcelona in the 13th century, that fashion has changed in my own lifetime. And that depending on where you go, you can't just say that women's clothing are just one thing. So he flat out says to start off, like, well, I don't even know what that is. That changes across time and space. So you have to narrow yourself into a particular window. And he said, but wait a minute, there's also a distinction amongst men's clothes. He said that when men are wearing cotton and linen, they're not dyed. But when men decide to wear silk and other fine clothes, they are all sorts of different colors. So he says the Torah, and this is a great example of where the literal read, it's not that it's not enough, but it's not enough, right? Like, well, there isn't just one uniform that all men and all women wear. So he's pointing aside to that there's a diversity of dress. And what would the upshot of that be? Like what I mean, he says that, okay, let's just read the next line, right? Okay, so he says, therefore, it's permissible to wear these in accordance with the custom of time and place. Meaning, if you assume that men don't wear silky, fancy colored clothes, but you happen to live in a community where that they actually do that, then it's fine that that's not cross-dressing. That's not wearing women's, because this is how the people around you dress, how they decide to do that. So that's a really good important. It's almost like the first time that we've really waded into like actual parameters around what you're allowed to wear. And what the Rashba is pointing out almost 1,000 years ago is any decision you're going to make around what is and isn't permissible in terms of dress has to take into account just like what's the societal norms. When I look out there, what does it look like everybody else is wearing, right? I still don't want to let go of my skinny jeans. I understand they're not popular anymore. I know everybody's wearing baggy clothes because it's the 80s all over again. I like my skinny jeans. And when I wear them, other people look at me and they're like, who is this guy, right? Like they look like I don't look like everybody else who's wearing, the uniform of the time. So according to the Rashba, I might be like, that Rabbi Jesse is like not keeping up with the times, right? So for him, it's very important to look at the kind of the broader norms. And the point here, listen, he lives in Barcelona. It's quite cosmopolitan. You're seeing an influence of non-Jewish practice, right? He's not only talking about what the Jews are wearing, I don't think. I think he's talking about kind of like what's the fashion of the day and what are people wearing and what does it seem like? So there's clearly a very broad perspective you have to take when you start enforcing certain limitations here. Okay, Vanix, the mom.
Jesse?
Yeah.
That it all comes down to the minhag of the area. And
Yeah.
if you remember when we studied about kashrut, a lot of that also had to do with the minhag of the area. What one area may be doing, the other one frowns on. And therefore you have to take in consideration where you are.
Exactly. And so let's even try and thread the needle even stronger here. When the question comes to what can women wear, the answer is what they are wearing. That let's go back and look at the kind of like humorous piece that Rav Lichtenstein said last week that we looked at when the student goes to Rav Lichtenstein and says, what's the halakhically permitted size of the opening of the neck of a woman's shirt? And the Rav says the size that your wife wears. He's not just being kind of cheeky there. He's actually drawing very firmly on the tradition that says, how do you determine what women wear? By what they wear. And that there's a direct line between Rav Lichtenstein's argument and the Tshuva Rashba. that we're looking at right here, where clearly the way people are behaving in a given time and place has an impact on the parameters of what you tell people they can wear.
Just bounce out a question,
Go ahead, yeah.
which is pretty, I don't know, basic, I guess. What is the difference between clothes of linen and cotton and clothes of silk and fine wool? I realize it's different material. I realize one is sort of a higher class than the other, but is that the only difference? I mean, I find it interesting that they would that the Rashba would separate out these four classes
No,
of material.
I don't know. I really don't know. Here, like, it would be interesting to go back and look at, like, what was the dress practices. Like, are there certain things associated with silk and fine wool? I think you're right that, like, cotton and linen are very normal, basic, everyday clothes, particularly in a warm, hot Mediterranean climate. I think that's probably it. I don't know fully. The only thing that I would say that's like, is it on purpose or not, is, there's the prohibition in the Torah on shatnez, which is the mixing of wool and linen. And so you see them in like two different categories here, right? Linen's up here and wool is down here, but I don't know if that's on purpose or not. Yeah. Mom.
Just to what Peter was saying, linen and cotton come from plants, silk and wool come from animals.
Oh, nice.
There
Okay.
might be
Cool.
that might have something to do with it, but I think Jesse, kind of what you were saying, I think linen and cotton are work clothes and wool and silk are dress clothes, I would think, or reflective of somebody's socioeconomic status in some way.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's for sure, right? Like he tells us absolutely.
Yeah.
So,
what I wanted to, and this, we might be going in this direction, but he's not saying that women can wear men's clothes and men can wear women's clothes. There's still that line, it's like the line that you eating pork is the line. So here, there can still be that line, so that a woman could not wear the clothing that a man would wear in a given time and place.
exactly. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. Yeah.
So he's not contradicting what's said in the actual.
No, definitely not. He's just telling us, if you're going to tell me that a man can't dress like a woman, I need to know in a given time and place what a woman dresses like, because in one time and place, it might look like a man's clothes look particularly feminine, and in another time, it might look like they don't, right? Okay, Peter, why don't you finish us off with the chivot then? Right, we said, therefore, it is permissible for them to wear these in accordance with the custom of time and place. Okay, and if.
There were a time and a place, where they are not accustomed to these either, these would be prohibited to them. And thus, for here there is a custom of women's clothing and men's clothing, and in other places, a different custom. The whole prohibition is in accordance with its custom, and the permission is in accordance with its custom. For what is a man's or a woman's garment is only defended for us in accordance with, is only defined for us in accordance with the customs regarding the garments in those years. So it's exactly what we just said.
Exactly. It's exactly what we just said, that yes, the prohibition is he's not knocking down the prohibition, but he is saying that you have to understand what the specific behaviors look like, because in a given time and place, depending on your perspective, it might look as though all of these men are dressed up like women. And you might say, hey, what's going on here? Leviticus says you can't do that. But then you realize, well, like, that's just how everybody dresses here, right? Then it's okay.
If you look at say, 16th century England,
yeah,
men's clothing was very, in our eyes, was very effeminate looking.
Yeah.
You know, with very flowery pantaloons and all that sort of stuff. And yet it was very much the custom and it was very much accepted.
Exactly. And what's important, and here's where we need to make it's helpful for like when you're gazing across time to remind ourselves of that. But the really important thing that the Rashba is helping us is that also works when you're not looking across 500 years of history. That also, or 800 years of history, that also works in a much narrower perspective, right? It also works in any given locale, right? That you can't think that what you think is right is necessarily what the community has. And again, here, where is the locus of authority, right? He's not saying God has clearly defined for you, oh men and women, the length of your clothes and your pantaloons and right. He's not saying that. He's saying just like, yeah, you can go and look and see what everybody's wearing. Look at all these beautiful colors and this fine silk and the linens and all of this lovely stuff that everybody's wearing. You know, and that's where the authority is. The authority is in Torah Timecha, right? This is not Musar Avicha. It's very much Torah Timecha. Yeah. I mean, also look how this has changed, right? Like linen today is much more expensive. And when people wear linen, it's kind of much more fancy schmancy. But in the time, it was probably just what they wore when they went out into the fields. Yeah. Okay, Mom.
I know there's a lot of scholarship around sort of the history of fashion over the centuries, but I'd be interested in knowing about times and places of transition, like liminal spaces. Like what happens when on this side of the street, people dress this way, and on the other side of the street, where things bump up against each other. You know, is there an area of transition? Same with time, like, you know, clothing evolves over time, and you often only realize that in retrospect, right? You don't see it when you're in the middle of it.
A great point. And I wonder if whoever wrote this She'elah, this question to the Rashba, if that's a reason why it exists, right? Like if you don't have to, if you ask the question, it means the answer is unclear, right? You don't ask the question. So I wonder if like, you know, everybody in Barcelona is like, nobody's asking this question because it's just everybody knows. But as soon as you start to get into that liminal period, then you start like, what do I do? So I wonder if the question itself that we're looking at comes from one of those points in time.
Yeah, like things are changing. How do I handle it?
Ask a question.
Or things are, you know, I mean, you think about Toronto, there's different practice, you know, at Bathurst and Lawrence than there is at you know, at Bathurst and Steeles kind of thing. So in communities where there are large numbers of Jews, I think you'll find these things bumping up against each other
Yes. Okay,
more.
so that's another point just to kind of put this off to the side is that all of this changes when you get to the modern, like the real modern period, where all of a sudden you have Jews of different types living with each other. It's really not happening yet. Certainly not in the certainly not to the degree of today, where if you drive down Bathurst, you'll encounter like 10 different uniforms of different Jews. That's not what we're talking about here. Things are much more, you know, even in a place like Barcelona, which is kind of very cosmopolitan, and like you have Jews and Arabs living with each other. That's it's not like today where you have discrete pockets of different Jewish communities all bumping up against each other. It's not quite like that. But that you would like then broaden out. And I think like today you would say like if I was walking around, you know, certain neighborhoods of Montreal and wasn't wearing very tight white stockings that were visible down around my legs and a big streimel on my head, I would look out of place. But I couldn't say, hey, look at all those Jews wearing the white stockings. Hey, they're dressing like women. They're not dressing like women. They're dressing like they dress in their community. Right? Okay, Vanix, and then let's take a look at the next text.
I just want to make a quick point. I mentioned the 16th century England, where the men's dress to us looked very feminine, but the women also dressed in a very different manner from the way in which the men dressed in 16th century England.
Yeah.
And Joy wanted to say something as well.
Jesse, one of my big issues with all of this and I'm talking modern day, not back then, is that a lot of it depends on what your rabbi says. And there shouldn't be a uniform code. It shouldn't be dependent on one individual to dictate what a particular congregation is doing. In other words, I know people who won't eat at other people's houses because they're not kosher enough.
Mhm.
And this bothers me that it's such, and I'm going to use the word power, is given to
Yeah.
one individual.
Yeah. I mean, it's a function of kind of the ebb and flow of Jewish time. And up until fairly recently, we had like these periods of contraction and expansion and contraction and expansion of like where authority was vested and located. And as you move ahead in time, it continues to get more and more decentralized, right? Um, this is a bit of a separate conversation, but like really like the major destabilizing event in recent history, of course, is the Shoah. And what happens when kind of the central authorities no longer exist, right? Now you have to rely on a much smaller pool of people who are learned in their particular chain of tradition. And you're absolutely right to point out that that's for people whose lives are guided by halacha, the sources of authority are not as robust as they have once been. And this is actually a critique you can find within Orthodoxy, right? A critique of saying like we've constricted a lot as a defense against modernity, right? Against kind of secularism. What's then becomes the impact? Well, actually, that's kind of the direction that this whole course of study is going in to say, and one of the impacts of that has been a much more restrictive approach around snus than what we're looking at here. And the case we're building up towards is to say it's not only about clothes, and even in the realm of clothes, the authority was clearly not vested in one person. It was vested in the community as a whole, particularly in the women. And that changes over time um, as a defense mechanism. Now, we might not like that, but I want to say, like, with a little bit of sympathy, that it's understandable. It's understandable that as your world is rapidly changing, that you want to put up fences. I would argue that while it's understandable, you have to do it in the right way, and that the application of it, as we'll come to see, has been restrictive in a way that is, I would say, is, and others, what I've learned from others is not commensurate with the tradition itself, which is just to go back to the idea of Musar Avicha and Torah Timecha. The conservative tradition is always there. Follow the Musar of your fathers, but not at the exclusion of the Torah of your mothers. I think they go together. Okay, that's actually a great place for us to pause today. We're not going to hop into the next text just because of where we are on time. But where we'll go in really in the coming weeks is next week we'll look at another text here on this question of like how men and women behave and can they behave like each other. And the reason that that's helpful is because it really helps highlight how the decisive factor on that is not an objective measure of permitted behavior, but really on the local custom in a given time and place. And that's, Joy, to your point, there is a strong temptation to say, give me like this text that's objective and binding for everyone. And that way I don't have to worry about like the power hungry individuals who are going to corrupt that we can all just share in this one tradition and know that everybody is kind of doing it with integrity. That's very tempting, right? Even for good liberals, it's very tempting, right? There's lots of leftist fascism, right? However, I would say do so at your own peril, right? And that's one of the things we're seeing in the tradition, that there is this very, very strong orientation toward towards the following the more popular viewpoint, right?
You know,
And
it's interesting, Jesse. It's like a whole group of separate individuals deciding that you have to count how many seconds the orange light is on before it turns red, if you're going to stop the car or are you going to go through?
what a great metaphor, right? We've used driving as a metaphor before, and that's really helpful. You can't live in a world where you say to everyone, just decide for yourself what the yellow light means.
Exactly.
Right? You can't, we could not function in that world. That's a world where that's one part of the legal tradition where you absolutely need Musar Avicha, right? I want the Ontario Highway Act to tell me what the yellow light means.
Exactly.
But that legal code doesn't tell me what route I have to take to get from A to Z. Right? And that's Torah Mecha. Again, what a lovely metaphor.
Legal code tells you that whatever route you may be taking, there's still going to be an orange light.
Exactly. Exactly.
But there's still personal interpretation of the orange light, because some people take it as license to speed up to get through before the light turns red, and other people will automatically stop as soon as they see it turn.
Sure,
So
sure.
there's both. It's like 100, the speed limit on 400 series highways in Ontario is 100, and everybody believes and behaves that actually equals 120,
That's minhag.
especially passing
That's minhag. And then and this is why you can apply religious law to driving. But you could say that, like, according to the we're going to see, this is a great like projection for where we go next week. The question next week is, what happens when you have a critical mass of people behaving in a certain way? How does that then change the tradition? Right? That's exactly the question we're going to look at. We're going to look at next.
And we just turned over the page, and the last line on the page says minhag overrides halacha.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see next week how that happens, because Peter's a
Spoiler alert, is it?
he's looking ahead, but that's okay. Yeah, that's where we'll get next week.